That's really a difficult one. It is a difficult one because we can always imagine things to be better. But the question is, uh, are such imaginations or utopia realizable? In other words, let me take, for example, climate change as an example where I had a disagreement with the tea growers. We can imagine a world where we are all happy with having the, reasonable minimal standard of living for everybody, which is compatible with planetary boundaries. We can imagine that, and you can actually technically put that on a piece of paper and calculate that that particular world would produce sufficient amount of calories or all other energy and so forth that human beings would be able to survive. But the question is actually, can such a world ever be brought into existence? And that's where you really encounter problems. You actually encounter problems that it would imply that many people who live now much more comfortably would have to lose 50 or 60% of their income. And you know that it's first, not likely, it's quite unreasonable to expect. And then you also have to admit that human condition is such that we generally tend to want more. So we will not be, or a significant percentage of us would not be just satisfied by having this quasi-substantial minimum. So yes, as I said, we can imagine situations like that, but we have to be realistic that we do not have the means, nor would it be desirable from the point of view of, let's call it, utility or utility of people or welfare of the people who are concerned to achieve that. But then I have to say that there is another danger there, is to go into the Panglossian world and to say whatever is now is actually the only possible solution and nothing can be changed. So we really have two opposite dangers. One danger is to imagine worlds of utopia which are unrealizable, or the other extreme is to believe that whatever now exists by the virtue of existence confirms that it's the only possible way of life. And I think both of these are wrong for opposite reasons, which means that we have to accept the life as it is, but try to improve it. I know that doesn't seem very sort of, grandiose. It does seem a little bit sort of limited, but I think that's the only way that the progress has been done, is actually by taking the starting point as a life as it is now, and then trying to improve wherever we can.
So it's like the politics of the small steps, I would say. Yes.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Actually, William mentioned that at the end too. Yes, it is a pragmatic policy of small steps. But personally, one thing that I really would like to avoid is, first, on the last question, I think definitely to avoid even grandiose utopias, or to avoid also a belief which is common among people that we have a natural system where actually nothing practically can be improved. So yes, it is a policy of small steps, but I think being aware that capitalism is a system that might not last forever, even if we do not have a blueprint. In my opinion, we do not have a blueprint in front of us that would change it. I also think that basically having a blueprint is even a wrong idea, because if you look in the past, and when you look how different systems have changed, that sounds pretty Marxist, but I think it's true. They have changed because they have gradually become more efficient, and they have replaced the other system through the kind of greater efficiency and the desire of people to accept such systems. In other words, it is, I think, very clear that serfdom was, in terms of output and production of output, less efficient than free labor being hired by capital. So it could happen, and I'm not kind of dismissing that, it could happen that actually some changes in the relative power or relative abundance of the factors of production make certain features of capitalism sort of go away. Let me just give an example. If you have a significant increase for like half a century or maybe a century of capital, on the other hand, with the plateauing of the global population at 10 or 11 billion people, you would certainly have a change in the relative abundance or scarcity of capital and labor. So it could be that actually like what we do nowadays with startups, that individuals themselves essentially put together a plan, they borrow the money, and the entrepreneurial function belongs to labor. So that could be one way that actually capitalism could be changed. So I'm not, as I said, ruling that. So I'm not actually against sort of thinking ahead. I'm just very careful, I think, at the current time, and when I said current time, I'm meaning like 10 to 15 years, of not really jumping to some big blueprints, especially when it comes to degrowth. Actually, that was one of my peeves here.
Great. Maybe one just follow-up question from me. In response to COVID, there's obviously been a lot of ideas on how we transform the system and the lessons we learn. And, always, it's not very pragmatic in the sense that we want to transform systems, but there's often a lot less emphasis on how we actually could pay for this, or what are the implications in terms of how states can raise revenues. And do you have any kind of ideas in this arena? Because, many would argue that we need a more progressive tax and benefit system to address things like inequalities. But do you have some thinking in this area that could be useful?
I actually think that I mean, as of now, and of course, as you know, unfortunately, this is not over yet. And to some extent, it seems to me that the virus is almost playing a game with us, because whenever we had the feeling that we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, something else has happened that actually pushed us back. So, but I think so far, to me, there are several lessons that I think we have learned. One is the need for much greater state role, particularly when it comes to health prevention on infectious diseases and other things, which were quite known in the past. So it is not new, but it has just been essentially forgotten. Also, the need, obviously, for many countries to have a control over the production of the essential goods that are needed in the case of epidemics. The second thing, which I think is going to stay with us, is that we have realized that many of the jobs can be done remotely, and that would have an implication for the global labor market, because it would act to some extent in some professions, it would really start mimicking the global labor market even without physical migration. So I think this is a big, change, because you would actually have people living in countries where the price level is lower and wages are lower, but they will be able to do the same job that people in France or the US or England are able to do, which I think leads to an interesting sort of a situation, that you would actually have an employer hiring somebody not for $50 in the US or the Western Europe, by hiring somebody for 20 in a much poorer country. But in that much poorer country, with the price level maybe being so low, much lower, the 20 would actually mean more than 50 in real terms. So you would have a very bizarre situation, that it would be a much cheaper worker, but the standard of living of that worker would be higher than the standard of living of the equivalent worker in the West, had the equivalent worker been hired. So I think it's an interesting issue from the welfare point of view, because the price differentials really play a big role there. And this is absolutely new. We didn't have that case in the past. So this, I think, will be another new element brought in by the pandemic. Finally, I have to say that in my Capitalism alone, I took relatively dim view of the UBI, And I still stand by the objections or the problems that I identified there. But I have to admit that if the UBI had been in existence during the pandemic, it would have smoothened the things significantly, because you would not need to go through all the basically political decision making, bring it to the parliament or the Congress to distribute really massive amounts of money in support. UBI would have done that automatically. So this is, for me, one area where I've somewhat changed my opinion. Now, of course, I do hope that we will not have emergencies like that, like every 5 years. So, no, if we happen to have them once a century, still the arguments against UBI, in my opinion, would remain strong. Nevertheless, I've modified my opinion on that.